So I'm the Director of Research with Topl. My name's Aaron. I'll be giving a talk today on Taktikos, our novel proof-of-stake consensus algorithm. And it's going to be kind of in two parts. The first part is going to go over some background information on distributed consensus and blockchain protocols in general. And then the second part is going to focus on time interval distributions and the kind of block time, the time intervals between blocks and their respective updates to the blockchain protocol in this proof-of-stake setting. So we'll be focused on a proof-of-stake protocol, and we'll be comparing to proof of work in a little kind of as a means of kind of setting the groundwork for some conceptual background required to understand what's called the staking procedure in these proof-of-stake protocols. So I'll begin by sharing my screen. All right. All right, so the first part of this talk in this series that's introducing Taktikos, we are going to be going over some blockchain basics, and in particular, we want to understand the security of these sort of what we call probabilistic protocols, probabilistic consensus protocols against the double spend attack. And in that context, we'll be trying to understand some details about proof of work and proof of stake. In particular, we'll be focused on proof of stake. But proof of work kind of sets the groundwork for understanding probabilistic block production. In the particular variant of Ouroboros that we're interested in, this is a proof of stake protocol, and Ouroboros Praos is the underlying protocol that we're kind of enhancing and adding to in this line of research. So we're by the end of the talk, we should have some intuition about the staking procedure that is central to the leader election mechanism in these consensus protocols. So in the first place, blockchain provides a distributed data storage for an immutable ledger that grows in time. And that's the principal functionality that a blockchain realizes. And data is kind of continuously injected into the system in the form of transactions, and we collect these transactions into groups called blocks. And each underlying block has a header that contains cryptographic commitments, cryptographic information that's used in the verification process, the verification step of the underlying protocol. And then we have a set of transactions that constitutes the block body. So each block has a unique identifier and this kind of block body associated with it. And a sequence of transactions plays out on a state that plays out in tandem with each update to the ledger, which is each block updates the ledger. And blockchains grow in time. And when a blockchain is extended, when a block is made, we call it an extension. And that extension always references a parent block. And the associated parent block forms a linked list. And this kind of linked list forms a segment of a blockchain. So in this, for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to be understanding blockchains as these linked lists with forward-directed arrows where the parent points to the child block. So children are associated with their parent block through these arrows. So parent blocks have their own unique identifier, but each block references a parent block with a identifier that's different from its previous parent block. So each new block has a unique identifier, and it can point to a unique block as its parent. So this constitutes the sort of Nakamoto style consensus. This was first put forward by Satoshi Nakamoto in the famous Bitcoin protocol. And the true novelty of that was incentivizing participation for a distributed consensus protocol. and incentivizing with block rewards, that is, rewards that are printed into the ledger just to incentivize the production of blocks in the first place. And there's also transaction fees that are collected by all the participants. So these the distributed ledgers that are sustained by these blockchain protocols have two properties that we're interested in for quantifying the security and the reliability of the underlying protocol. So that's liveness, and liveness corresponds to new information being confirmed. So the growth of the blockchain ledger. And then persistence corresponds to a history of events, a history of transactions that becomes persistent in time, that becomes immutable. And then these probabilistic protocols, the context is that blocks can reorg and blocks can change. Blocks can, blocks are immutable, but blocks can become orphaned by another block. There can be forks and ties. And we have to design these protocols to be secure against an adversary. So here we're representing participants, honest participants, as these angels, and then the adversary is going to be represented as this horned devil figure. And the idea behind distributed consensus is that all the honest participants will agree on what the blockchain history is. And then an adversary will be trying to bias that history in some way with their own blocks that they've come up with privately. And the private blocks will be indicated with red colors. But these different colors correspond to different block IDs. So if the colors are in agreement, that means the block IDs are in agreement. And as we look in the more like kind of general sense, these distributed consensus protocols are being maintained by this blockchain protocol. The security properties depend on the protocol rules, and we have to be able to make predictions about the protocol rules to be able to assess the security properties. So those three main components that we're kind of concerned with in this style of Nakamoto consensus is the leader election process, eligibility verification, and chain selection. So the leader election is this process of block leaders being elected through the leader election process in the blockchain protocol. And that looks like a single block being proposed by one participant at a time. And a chain selection algorithm assures that all honest participants will agree on the blockchain history, on what blocks actually constitute a canonical view of the present state of the blockchain and the present state of the ledger. And the idea being behind the cryptographic information that's contained in headers is that you can verify that a block proposer was actually elected leader according to the protocol rules. So chain selection is always filtering out bogus chains and chains that don't correspond to the latest ledger, and selecting what we believe, what the protocol rules dictate to be the latest blockchain ledger. And that corresponds to the longest chain, the most up-to-date blockchain ledger. So in this kind of situation where there's a lot of distributed participants and we don't know who's going to be elected block leader at a given time, forks can occur. And that is different blocks that pertain to different blockchain histories. So the state of this blockchain here is different from the state of this blockchain because it had different blocks play out along its history, along its chain. So there'll be two different views of what the ledger corresponds to, what the ledger state is. So this unsettled situation is undesirable for consensus because we want all the honest participants to always agree on all the blocks all the time. That's the goal. So forks deviate from that, and they're just kind of introduced all the time because of network delay. And in these contexts of probabilistic block production, you have the possibility of multiple block proposers simultaneously. So two block proposers might have come up with the same block in the same time, and they wouldn't have had the time to synchronize and know about one block or the other. And the idea is that you can keep making extensions on those forks, and the common prefix, that is the portion of the chain that all participants agree on, varies in time. It varies and fluctuates. So we want to design a protocol that has a small portion of unsettled blocks and a large common prefix that's close to the most recent blocks. And that's the goal. That's the security goal of modeling and designing these protocols. So this is all in the face of a pretty big assumption in the distribution of the participants, and we call this the honest majority assumption. Most resources are controlled by honest parties at any given time. And when I say resources, that corresponds to the eligibility to produce blocks, the rights to forge blocks and make new blocks. And here we're using the terminology somewhat interchangeably because this is general to proof of stake and proof of work. And keep in mind that we're in this probabilistic block production kind of paradigm, and we have only some assurance that the adversary won't catch up. Probabilistically, all these security arguments that we're making are probabilistic. But under an honest majority assumption, we can say the honest chain that is publicly known to the majority of participants will be the canonical actual blockchain with the most up-to-date ledger information. And that any fork won't be sufficiently long to overtake the main chain at any given time. Because this adversary that's trying to privately fork the blockchain can't catch up. They don't have enough resources to catch up. The next slide shows a different situation with a hypothetical adversary that has a majority of resources. And this kind of cartoon is designed to indicate that this more powerful adversary can overtake the main chain because they're probabilistically going to create more blocks in a given time frame. So this sort of 51% attack can be mounted. So even though this doesn't, in the reality, this doesn't always require more than 51% of the resources, but it's the name stuck, and the adversary, once they launch this form of attack, they dominate the network. They have the freedom to bias the ledger. So this threat model that we're concerned with in designing the protocol to be resilient against is this forking adversary. They're always producing a private fork. And that's not to say that that's the only adversarial strategy. There's many, many others, but we're focused on this one because it's the most serious threat to the consistency of the blockchain protocol. And when I say consistency, that means the agreement on the blockchain history that all participants maintain at any given time. So this private chain attacks, double spend attacks, selfish mining attacks, they're all kind of related to this activity of a private adversary maliciously constructing blockchain forks. And to go over a specific example, I wanted to just go over the steps of the double spend attack. And so the first step is we have this public chain that's in nice friendly colors and then a private chain that's in red colors, right? So the first step is to include a transaction publicly on the honest chain. And then that transaction won't be included on the malicious private chain. But anybody that's participating in the protocol will see this transaction and see that it's valid, put it in a block, and then the next block will come along, and that transaction will be sufficiently deep in the blockchain to be confirmed, however many blocks you want to wait. So the next step is to privately include a conflicting transaction in the malicious chain. So here where transaction 2 is a conflicting transaction with respect to transaction 1, so that if transaction 2 appears, transaction 1 wouldn't have been considered valid. So the next step is to wait. And once this segment of chain has been adopted by enough participants, and then it's sufficiently deep in the public chain, you exchange goods. You exchange. You can exchange based on the ledger state of the transaction one that was produced by transaction one. And then the next step is to simply reveal the longer private chain, forcing the network to adopt it and overriding and reorging the first transaction. So that's what a reorg actually is. And this a reorg constitutes the majority of the network going from one blockchain to another diverging blockchain where some common prefix was buried in the past. So this reorg occurs, and honest participants now see the ledger state associated with transaction 2, and transaction 2 conflicted with transaction 1. So transaction 1 is no longer valid. What's more, it will never appear on a future block because nobody will be able to adopt it, or it'll make any block that includes it invalid. So this hypothetical adversary is able to take the money and run in this context. So with that kind of threat model in mind, we want to design protocols with limited block production. We want to limit block production to some degree so that this hypothetical adversary can't make a longer chain. And in the proof of work setting, that is a method of generating blocks in a resource constrained fashion, it's a way of limiting chain growth based on a physical resource. And in this context, the proof of work mechanism is the limited resources, the amount of work that you can put in a given time frame. And this is known as Nakamoto consensus. So parties are continuously searching for valid proofs that satisfy the protocol rules, and those valid proofs are then printed into block headers, and everybody can quickly verify those proofs, even though it took a long time, a lot of computational resources to find those proofs. They're fast to verify, and that's the main mechanism behind proof of work that prevents people from just spamming blocks on the network, and that is making lots of diverging blockchain histories all the time. So this mining race ended up scaling to orders and orders of magnitude as far as the resources that have been devoted to mine blocks. And these physical computational resources end up taking a lot of energy. The energy requirements are astronomical for the Bitcoin protocol presently. And it's on the order of a small country, the amount of energy required to maintain the chain growth rates of the Bitcoin protocol. So we have questions? Sure. Okay. So chain selection means cutting off all the forks with a knife. I suppose you could say that. I feel like the chain selection rule is the knife that cuts out all the bogus chains. Yeah, it's a filtration rule that applies to all blockchain protocols, right? And basically what we're going to see in proof of stake is that we use variations on chain selection. So the knife it's a Swiss Army knife with multiple modes. You can have different contexts in different chain selection contexts for different cryptographic primitives. So for instance, longest chain rule was enhanced with a proof of work kind of scaling chain selection rule. So in the Bitcoin protocol, where it was the proof of most work, proof of the most difficult blocks. So like blockchain difficulty played a role in chain selection in Bitcoin. In proof of stake, chain selection plays an even bigger role, one in filtering adversarial bogus tines, bogus blockchain forks, but also just in enacting in enabling bootstrapping from the Genesis block. So parties that want to synchronize with the latest ledger information have to download the entire blockchain history. And in proof of stake, there's a lot more cryptographic primitives to check and verify. So the chain selection rule becomes much more nuanced. Even though the primary, like, longest chain rule is still there, because in principle, the same goal of having the longest chain, the largest up-to-date ledger state is one and the same with the original proof of work Nakamoto style protocol. So in that sense, it's not too different. Sure. How can we tell when a block is sufficiently settled for use? There's ways of measuring it in production. There's ways of measuring the depth of these blockchain forks, but you have to query all honest nodes, and they have to opt into participating. So there's some, let's see, there's some tools, there's some means of estimating the settlement depth based on how long the reorgs are. You can, like, count the number of blocks in the natural kind of reorgs that are induced by network delay, or network latency. And the rate of block production is also plays a role. And so, like, knowing those features of the blockchain protocol from the kind of predictions that you can make from the security models allows you to say, okay, probabilistically, a hypothetical adversary that's, like, constructing a longer chain in this time frame would have had so many blocks with this probability. So there's a chance that an adversary could catch up with by forking from a given point, and then we give a probabilistic guarantee as far as if this block shows or appears so deep in the chain, then it has a probability of being reordered. So, and we can make those computations. And that's where the nuance of all the theoretical modeling and predictive modeling comes into play. Sure. Okay. Okay, thank you. So we're ready to go? All right. So again, I'm Aaron Schutz, Director of Research with Topl Labs, and I'm in the midst of introducing proof of stake, and we've kind of gotten a little taste of what proof of work is and why it's kind of a mechanism that's useful for Nakamoto style consensus. But now we're looking at proof of stake as this alternative to the proof of work mechanism. So we want to eliminate that proof of work mechanism in principle because it's an energy race. It's just an energy sink. The computational race is too wasteful, and it doesn't scale enough. It doesn't scale with participation. So in this proof of stake mechanism, instead of having a computational race, we have an orderly queue that's set up through the protocol rules. But now we're coupling that orderly queue, that line that everybody's kind of showing up, waiting to be eligible in a predictable fashion. And then that predictability plays a role in the security of the protocol, but it's a kind of sacrifice we have to make to actually work around this proof of work mechanism. So proof of stake couples that eligibility with the blockchain ledger itself. So there's no mining in proof of stake. This mining, we don't want to confuse that process of mining, that wasteful, energy-consuming hashing race that plays a role in Bitcoin. That everybody's who's minting blocks and mining blocks is constantly searching for new blocks. In this context, we're minting blocks based on the eligibilities that are produced through the ledger itself. And these slots or rounds, in a round-based protocol, it proceeds synchronously in discrete time intervals. And in this context, we're calling them slots, but we could call them rounds too. And honest participants view blocks and adopt blocks in the same way, but blocks fall into discrete slots. And the time between them depends on how long the slot is. So slots can have different time intervals. You could have 1 second slots or 2 second slots. You could have 20 second slots if you wanted to for a slower protocol. So this waiting for the eligibility means that most of the time a participant's going to be waiting for either their own eligibility. They're going to be quietly doing that because that doesn't take as much computational power to actually know when you're going to be eligible, because it's all local operations that are kind of playing out. And then the adoption of blocks is quick to verify. So there's no computational waste going on. That's the point. So this orderly, synchronous kind of execution eliminates the wasteful energy use. And this Nakamoto style proof of stake, in this context, the same kind of picture plays out, where honest participants are accumulated on some canonical view of the blockchain, and their blocks appear in discrete time intervals, but we still have the longest chain rule. We still have the true chain corresponding to the most blocks. And then we still have a genesis block, and in this context, our resource is stake. So that means it would take more stake than the honest majority to overtake the main chain. So this main chain is secure against these private attacks, so long as that adversary doesn't have a majority of the stake. So the honest majority assumption is still here and still plays a role. So justifying the use of proof of stake over proof of work is kind of, it seems like a no-brainer, but the reality of it is it's a lot more complicated to actually implement and engineer. And the goal, right, is to provide this permissionless, trustless setup for participants to actually utilize and maintain the blockchain protocol without external authority. But we also simultaneously want to secure the protocol against this so-called Byzantine adversaries that can act arbitrarily to bias the protocol in their favor. So in this context, in proof of stake, there's a lot more degrees of freedom that the adversary can take advantage of. So that means there has to be a lot more cryptographic constraints that prevent an adversary from tampering the protocol. And the nuanced kind of trade-off between speed of transaction throughput, the scale of participation, and this underlying security against this Byzantine adversary is sometimes called the blockchain trilemma. And this is kind of an emergent property that's been identified by the research community of these style of protocol, that optimizing one kind of sacrifices the other two. So if you optimize for speed, you just necessarily sacrifice the scale of participation and the security of the underlying protocol. So these protocols can't go too fast because it basically allows people to make blocks at an arbitrary rate. The whole point of the chain selection rule and the kind of resource constrained chain growth is to limit chain growth in the first place, to keep people from spamming blocks. And in proof of stake, we are in a context where adversaries can make blocks arbitrarily, but we see in its property of this Ouroboros, which this proof of stake protocol, which is really a more general, like, mathematical framework for understanding protocols and understanding the sort of blockchain forks that can arise in these round-based protocols. So a lot of the analysis that went into the first Ouroboros protocol is more general to many different types of proof-of-stake protocols. But in this case, we're in the context of Ouroboros Praos, so we are in a situation where block leaders can be elected, but there can be empty slots. There can be slots where no blocks arise. So our execution forks or execution graphs that represent our blockchain forks end up looking something like this, where the blocks are falling into discrete slots, and there's empty slots in between blocks. And that naturally means, since slots correspond to time, there's going to be some time intervals between blocks. And then that time intervals can be random, or they can be lots of different types, sizes of time intervals between blocks. And in this context, we're still concerned with the honest participants. And here we're indicating that maybe 2 honest participants made 2 blocks simultaneously. And here we're indicating that an adversary was elected leader in this slot. Some adversarial resource is controlled by some party that wants to fork the network at this point. So they made 2 blocks atop 2 different blockchains to try and perpetuate this fork. But then an honest participant was elected in this slot and continued the construction of these blockchain forks. So the gist of this is to understand these execution graphs in these discrete slot nature, but also the goal is to show that these forks don't get too long. And then that gives us this settlement property. So the settlement property, like if you have this block, how assured can I be that it's settled? That comes from the analysis of these sorts of execution graphs and the distributions of the time intervals between the blocks. So the staking procedure is this leader election mechanism used in the Ouroboros Praos proof-of-stake protocol. And here I'm listing this different cryptographic functionalities that play a role, but we have public-private key signatures used to allocate funds and transact on the blockchain ledger. And it's basically the credentials of the blockchain ledger dictate, since the ledger itself is playing a role in consensus, this public-private key signatures play an enhanced role in the security of these proof-of-stake protocols. And what's more, there's a verifiable random function, which is a special functionality for producing public-private key signatures, but also producing a verifiable random output from those signatures. And that's what we call a slot's proof. So the proofs correspond to the eligibility to mint a block in a given slot. And then the key evolving scheme is a means of authenticating individual blocks headers and signing off on individual blocks. It's another public-private key construction, and primarily it's present to act as a proof of activity and a way of preventing past information from being forged again, reforged, or a forgery from being constructed from a leaked private key. So this keeps the protocol forward secure, and forward secure means you can't produce signatures from a piece of private information that has evolved in a future time. So the past information is safe. That's the idea. So this is all the ingredients that are needed for this threshold-based staking and the staking procedure. And firstly, it defines the leadership eligibility for a given slot. And it's based on a participant's state, and that is the digital assets that they're using to grant the rights to forge, to make a block. And we want to distinguish between relative stake versus total stake. And that is, a relative stake is this fractional value, is a proportion of stake that you control relative to the total stake that's on the network. And each individual slot has a nonce value, and that's a number between 0 to 1 that corresponds to the sort of random dice roll that gives the randomness to these leader election mechanism. So, and then these nonce values are compared against the staking threshold function, which is another constraint that's kind of put into the protocol to mitigate people getting some advantage from splitting their accounts into multiple, splitting their stake into multiple accounts. So a block is valid if and only if this nonce value for the given slot is less than the staking threshold function for that participant. So these are the kind of underlying principles of proof-of-stake blockchains and their security properties. And I want to summarize by kind of driving home the point between proof-of-stake versus proof-of-work. Proof-of-stake is a way of reproducing the probabilistic block production of proof-of-work in the same security setting, in the same kind of peer-to-peer setting. And Ouroboros is one variant of proof-of-stake protocols that we're interested in developing and furthering. And the individual rounds of this protocol and the individual leader eligibilities are defined by the staking procedure, which comes down to comparing cryptographic information with this threshold function that's dictated by the stake of the participants. So I'll pause here for questions, and this will be a break in between parts 1 and 2